nobody in an ivory tower anywhere. None of the speakers, in fact, live in any ivory tower or speak from any ivory tower. Each and every one, and I will leave to Professor Storer the opportunity to introduce the CTI scholars. The key theme of the people gathered here today is that each and every one is actively involved in their own community and indeed globally in this work of faith-related, faith-inspired peace building writ large, not just in terms of negotiating ceasefires and or halting conflicts, but quite frankly, from everything from eradicating poverty to ensuring adequate healthcare for all, quality healthcare for all, peace in its widest possible sense, what Religions for Peace refers to as positive peace, which is the means to live with dignity, quite frankly. Each and every person on this call is a leader of thought and a leader of praxis. COVID has presented us with an unparalleled, in our historical memory and consciousness at least, tragedy, catastrophe, but also, as we will hear, an opportunity to connect to the way that we think, the way that we believe, and the way that we behave. And we will be hearing more of this from our distinguished speakers over the various facets of leadership in times of crisis. Before COVID, we were already facing a severe leadership crisis. Before COVID hit, we were all speaking in our different venues about the fact that we are lacking for leadership. We were also speaking about the lack of institutional credibility. Our institutions had begun to lack credibility and legitimacy. COVID has only threatened this space, has only made some of these threats even more urgent, even more necessary, even more unavoidable. This is a conversation to speak about what we nevertheless can bring to the table as thought leaders, as spiritual leaders, as leaders of practice in this particular space. With that, I'd like to hand over to Professor William Storer as our moderator, with my deep thanks to each and all.
Thank you, Professor Karam, for that inspiring introduction to our colleagues in this conversation. May I introduce mine now from the Center of Theological Inquiry in Princeton, New Jersey. The center convenes leading thinkers in our interdisciplinary research environment. We consider together global concerns, not only from the perspective of theologians and scholars of religions, but research scholars and scientists in the sciences and humanities. And so I'm honored to introduce three of my colleagues in our international research network. First, Professor Liz Grant, who is a co-director of the Global Health Academy at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. Liz is an international leader and expert in the whole field of global public health, but has a background in the study of religion and theology that informs her concern for your key role as religious leaders and thought leaders around the world. And then my colleague, Dr. Frederick Simmons, is an ethicist, a religious ethicist, who has a particular concern in environmental ethics and has been working with us at the center, thinking about the nature of life on this planet and our ethical responsibility as integrally part of the natural world and planetary life. And I'm also delighted to introduce my third colleague, Dr. Lisa LaRue from the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. Lisa is a sociologist who does fieldwork research on gender-based violence and its relationship to religious communities and traditions around the world. Lisa does extensive fieldwork in many conflict-ridden parts of the world and will bring rich insights from that research to our conversation. We're going to structure this conversation on leadership in a pandemic world around three themes. We're thinking about the pandemic world first and the challenge to leadership it is now representing. And we'll hear from Liz Grant in a moment on what the nature of this pandemic is and its impact on global public health. Before I turn to you as the leaders in the conversation to reflect on how you are facing that challenge of the new normal in your leadership role. And then we'll think about the pandemic's impact in two areas in relation to the environment and the integral relationship between Religions for Peace's environmental concerns and the pandemic and its impact on the environment. And I'll turn to Frederick Simmons to lead that conversation before inviting you in. And then I'll turn to my colleague, Lisa LaRue, to reflect on what is being reported around the world, tragically, the increase in gender-based violence in relation to the lockdown and the public health emergency. And we will reflect on that impact and your key role and insights into how do we challenge the environmental and human cost of this current global emergency. But our focus is on what holistic leadership means in religious communities and in the wider public community and global community at this time. So we will turn, thirdly, to leading in a pandemic world. And I'll return again to my colleague, Professor Grant, to reflect with us on what one model of holistic leadership might mean before drawing on all your wisdom from your great world religious traditions and your own leadership experience and insights to help us think on the heart of our conversation. So we turn first to the pandemic world that we now find ourselves in. And I would invite Professor Liz Grant to give us a brief opening presentation on COVID-19 and its global impact so that we have a baseline in the science before turning to the leadership challenge that it represents in your communities around the world. Professor Liz Grant, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be with all of you to explore these issues. I have a few slides which I hope will come up, and just so that I can briefly take you through the context of this pandemic. And it's hard to believe that 121, sorry, next slide. Thank you. It's really hard to believe that 121 days ago, the world heard about coronavirus, but we heard it came just almost silently, a group of Chinese scientists saying there's a new cluster of pneumonia cases, which are unusual because they're from the coronavirus. And the coronavirus, named because it looks like a crown, the coronavirus circulates among animals, but it jumps into humans. Bats have been its main retainer, but we know from the MERS epidemic, the Middle East respiratory syndrome, which was coronavirus related, that had come from camels. We know from the early SARS epidemic that had come through from civet cats. So we have this just 121 days ago, we have this message that there is this new coronavirus, and the majority of people in the public health world, and then probably all of you, if you heard about it, thought it'll be contained, it'll be closed, it'll be okay. It's terrible what's happening for those people in Wuhan, but it will move on. And that's not been the case. It was terrible what happened in Wuhan, and it has continued to be terrible. And on the 11th of March, this year, the World Health Organization director, Dr. Tedros, declared this global pandemic, a pandemic because it was affecting so many countries, and that the rate of transmission of this disease was rising exponentially rather than in a linear fashion. At that stage, there was 118,000 cases in 114 countries in the world. And at that stage, on the 11th of March, not long ago, 4,291 people had lost their lives. And the director suggested that we needed a whole of government, whole of society approach to deal with this pandemic. Next slide. Just very briefly, and you know this already, I'm sure, just a comment about the spread. And this is why this is so dangerous. It's respiratory droplets and aerosols, so sneezing, being together, people coughing, people talking, being in close proximity when air can carry. We know it comes from potentially touching the virus, or touching surfaces that the virus has been on. The silence, the danger is people who are asymptomatic can be spreading this. We know there's 3 phases of it, though the knowledge, the scientific knowledge is changing all the time. That initial phase of some fever, cough, sore throat, possibly very, very mild. Then for some people, it goes on to a much more significant phase of hypoxia. And then for a minority, it goes on to become a really serious decompositioning illness. And that's what we're seeing in the world today. And that's what makes this so frightening. We know who's at risk. Everyone's at risk, but there are people who are particularly at risk. And those people who are particularly at risk are people all of us in faith communities are working with. The elderly are particularly at risk. Those who are living in close community, those who have underlying conditions, particularly underlying conditions such as cardiovascular disease or respiratory disease, diabetes. For some reason, men are a little bit more at risk than women. And obviously those who are in care positions, health workers, and those who are offering spiritual care are at risk. Next slide, please. So in the next couple of slides, just for a minute really, I just want to give you just little snapshots to get the seriousness of this. This is the data from yesterday, from the 27th. 2.92 million confirmed cases across the world, and 205,000 deaths. A huge number. From that number, we heard about March the 11th of 4,291 deaths. The shift. So next slide, please. And every country, just about every country is affected. There are very few countries now who are not. And what that slide is trying to do is to show you something really significant. It's showing this exponential rise in the number of people who are infected, and the number of people who have tragically died in a space across the number of days from the time that a country identified five people in the country had died. And as you can see, there's different countries have managed this very differently, but you can see that the impact on lives. Next slide, please. This slide just tries to show those who are most at risk and are those who have succumbed to this disease, this rapidly succumbed to this disease. And again, there's no, from those who are 10 to 19, we're seeing upwards, though we are now also hearing of a few cases in children. But you can see those who are middle-aged, those who are moving into to older age, that are elders in society, those who have the wisdom are very much have been hugely impacted by this. Next slide, please. And this slide, a global slide, just to give you a picture of where the confirmed cases are across the world, and where, and as you can see, and the thing to really mention is that our numbers, our confirmed cases, are probably 10% of our actual cases, because many people and many countries do not have testing facilities, which is something we'll maybe talk about later in the context of faith responses. So, but the deeper the purple, the more intense, the more significant. But our questions will also be, in countries where there's low health resources, how many people actually are carrying this illness? Next slide, please. So coming back to this message about response, we know there's 5 criteria around the response, and many of you will have been dealing with some of the response of mitigation and containment strategies. The first is around prevention, the clear messaging around transmission of the risks, ways to keep safe. How do we ensure that each person in community understands the knowledge about what's happening and the way that they themselves can keep safe, prevent the disease from affecting them, but also protect others from the disease. Preparedness is essential. WHO speaks often about preparedness. How do each of us and each of our communities look at the preparedness strategies for public health? What does it look like in a partnership? And if anything this disease has taught us is that it has to be in partnership. We cannot, it's a disease that has such repercussions that it cannot be handled by the public health domain. And this is where faith communities have an extraordinary role now in highlighting the stresses, highlighting the violence, highlighting the responsiveness, highlighting the work of health workers, highlighting the strategies of mitigation, and as we go through this disease, highlighting what a post-COVID world would look like as peacemakers and as political leaders working together so that no one, the people, are left behind. Next slide. Thank you. So I'll turn back to Professor Storer.
Thank you very much, Liz, for that very clear introduction to the baseline in the medical global health pandemic that we're working to think through the leadership implications of now. I want to turn to a number of our distinguished leaders in turn to ask for you to reflect briefly on what the single biggest leadership challenge is in your part of the world and in your community at this time. And I wonder if we might go first to Asia and to Japan and to the Reverend Megumi Wada, if you would unmute your mic, Reverend Wada, and reflect with us on the challenge as you see it from your leadership position in Japan.
Thank you, the moderator. In Japan, the number of infected people continues to increase, especially in urban areas. And as Professor Liz mentioned, we are facing the lack of testing facilities. So the actual number or actual situation has not been clear yet. And also in Tokyo and also in all Japan, the emergency declaration has been issued, and we are required to reduce physical contact between people by 80% in the name of Stay Home Week. And as far as I know, all of the religious facilities are closed down, but many of them keep doing through the internet. So the ways of communication between people have been changing, on the process of changing. And in Visual Koseka itself, we do have the hospital, affiliated hospital, and the hospital accepts patients, and we surrender a dormitory for staff to divert it to an accommodation facility for medical workers who cannot return home. So, and also on the other hand, problems are emerging for those who do not have a home and those whose home is not a safe place. Support for homeless people who have become internet cafe refugees due to the closure of internet cafe, domestic violence, and other people who have now nowhere to go has become an issue. So we are struggling to how to accommodate those people as a religious community who has facilities, but because of the risk to become a place of cluster, so it's very difficult to make a decision. That is my overall brief picture of Japan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that clear picture, your context in Asia, Reverend Wada. I wonder if I might turn to Chief Rabbi David Rosen now for a picture where you are, David, but particularly focusing on what the challenge for religious leadership is in the context of this pandemic that Professor Grant and Reverend Wada have described both globally and locally for us. David.
It's really a very big question because the Jewish community, I don't know how atypical it is, but it is, from a leadership point of view, both problematic and provides also a particular constructive opportunity. It's problematic because we are a highly fragmented community. You probably know the witticism, if you have two Jews, you have three opinions. There are different streams within Judaism, even within each particular structure. Within my own stream of Judaism, within Orthodoxy, we are broken down into different communities where different people will accept, if you like, small structured leadership, but very few will see centralized leadership as having any binding power over them. In that sense, we don't have Max Weber's category of traditional charismatic leadership model for the community as a whole. There are those segments, especially amongst ultra-Orthodoxy, that do have that, but not for the vast majority. I would say that there are, as a result, a number of particular challenges. Probably the biggest challenge is to impress upon everybody, including subset communities, of how interconnected and interdependent they are. And very often these communities live in a certain degree of tension with one another. I should say the positive, what I was talking about before, one of the positive aspects of the structure of the Jewish community is that we are a religious community, if you like, faith community, even though there are different understandings of what faith means, but with a sense of some kind of family connectedness. Indeed, Judaism is a religion born out of a people, and is how to ensure that these different elements fragmented within can nevertheless understand their interconnectedness amongst each other and beyond. To understand that today, it's not only not possible to live in isolation, to do so is actually dangerous. And you actually are threatening yourself if you try to cut yourself off from the wider context. So that, I think, becomes the major challenge. There are other challenges as well, which of course is the result very often of historical trauma. We have a fair share of historical trauma within our community, and the use of conspiracy theories, which is prevalent amongst modern technology, to be able to propagate anti-Semitic propaganda, has certainly caused a lot of added trauma within the community that one has to deal with and has to provide reassurance for. But I think that the overall challenge is to impress upon people that today, actually, we cannot depend upon institutional leaders for leadership. In today's world, everyone has to be a leader in the sense of being an exemplar, and to give people an understanding of their individual responsibility in the context of the challenge and beyond it.
That's very helpful, David. Thank you so much for that. I wonder if I might turn to Professor Ramajan now, in the United States, but reflecting, Professor, on the challenge for the Hindu community, not only in India, but around the world.
Thank you very much, Professor Storer. As you said, all of my immediate context is the United States. I will like to respond by offering a few thoughts globally. I would say that except for some very isolated claims, I am not discerning conflicts within the Hindu world between recommendations coming from the world of medical science and opposition from the religious community. So Hindu religious leaders do not have the challenge of convincing practitioners to adopt hygienic and sanitation measures to limit the spread of the virus. I think very high ethical value in the Hindu tradition for not harming, for saving lives is very much alive, and this necessitates a willingness to alter religious practices when necessary. So that has not been the arena of religious challenge. Where such challenges exist in the Hindu world, and I'm speaking particularly of India, these are the consequences of living in conditions of extreme poverty that make social distancing impossible, and where there is a lack of material resources for sanitation practices. So the structural inequalities that cause poor communities to suffer disproportionately the effects of COVID-19 is really a high on the list of the challenges. And of course, this requires commitment by the state, by civic organizations, as well as religious communities. But one challenge that I do want to highlight, which is, I think, extremely disturbing, and I think we'll come back to it in the course of our conversation, is the problem of scapegoating. I think we are very well aware of the historical tensions between Hindus and Muslims on the Indian subcontinent, and the history of violence, even in recent times, between these two communities. And very sadly, what I am seeing is a fear, ignorance, rumors, in some cases, intentional political incitement. These have intensified a very difficult historical relationship and has resulted in blaming, in this case, blaming the minority Muslim community for the spread of the virus in India. And the consequence has been a rise in violence against the Muslim communities in India. So what we are witnessing, which is, I think I want to really flag it as a major leadership challenge, is the well-known tendency to blame our suffering on those in our community who are different. Pandemics, as you know, Professor Storer, can be occasions for intensifying racism and xenophobia. And we are already seeing the rise of hate and violence in many parts of our world. So the combating of scapegoating, xenophobia during this time is an obligation and challenge for Hindu religious leadership. And in fact, I would say for all religious leadership. It is really an opportunity for leaders of specific communities to speak on behalf of the human community and to commend caring and empathy. So there are times when the challenge of leadership is not so much the defense of one's own community or caring for one's own community, but the willingness to speak on behalf of those who are the victims of scapegoating and violence by one's own community. So I would say, to conclude, that helping our communities in these times is not only about ensuring that they are safe from physical infection, but ensuring also that their hearts grow in love and compassion for all human beings. We have to also inoculate against the virus of hate is spreading. And we should all aspire, provide leadership to help our fellow beings to come through this pandemic as better human beings.
Thank you so much, Professor. We'll come back to these themes as we turn to questions of the impact of the pandemic on violence, both domestic and inter-community violence. Could we turn now to Africa? And I wonder, Sheikh Mubabji, I wonder if we might invite you to reflect with us on the situation in Uganda and your part of East Africa, if you're on the line with us now. Welcome, Your Eminence. I wonder if Sheikh Mubabji is online and able to join us now. If not, if we'll work on that technical question and come back to you very briefly. I wonder if we could then turn to Tunisia and to the Honorable Labidi Mayaza and welcome you into the conversation and your expert perspective from Tunisia and North Africa. Welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for this very important meeting, and Ramadan Kareem to all those practicing Ramadan. Well, in Tunisia, we started feeling that this COVID-19 is a serious affair after listening and watching TV on what is happening in Italy. Because Italy is a very close country to Tunisia, and we have many links with Italy. And I think this was very important, even on level of religion, of values, because I think suddenly everybody starts realizing that we are one as a human being, we are one. And what is endangering others is also endangering us. And Tunisian started praying for Italian, started the measures of course, confinement and at first it was not that difficult. Convincing people to stay home and also to keep distance, safe distance and hygiene, and even the teachings of Prophet Muhammad a lot, let's say, communicating with people. The real challenge started when the government and the Ministry of Religious Affairs announced the closing of mosques. And there were no more prayers in mosques. This was a real challenge. Because people felt as if in hard times, they are deprived of going to mosque, and this in a way weakened them. And our role as religious leaders was to revisit the meaning of prayer. Is the prayer only institutional? Is prayer only done in mosque? Is a valid prayer? And especially I personally, I spoke to the Ministry of Religious Affairs and to many Muslim religious leaders, and asked them to talk directly to people on videos, on social media, to speak about the importance of prayer within family, of reweaving the links, the spiritual links within the family, because we need this now. And the second challenge was the challenge of, let's say, taking care of those who are weakened by the crisis. You know, poor people who are also immigrants, and especially illegal immigrants, who are most of them African in Tunisia, were the weakest, and how to mobilize people to help them, to support them, and not to let them without any support, sometimes even without no houses, because they have no more wages and salaries to pay their housing. And we also resorted to religious values to mobilize people to help each other. And the good surprise is that we were, let's say, trying since now 2 years to launch a network of interfaith in Tunisia, not of specialists speaking of religion, no, of interfaith done by people. And this was possible with this COVID-19 crisis. And we have very often conferences online, and we get in touch, encouraging each other, and especially communicating with people from different faiths. And I think this is, let's say, the positive side of facing together as people of faith this crisis. Do you hear me?
I should listen to the moderator, Professor Karam. We thank you very much, Honorable Labida Meeza, for these insights and highlighting the importance of religious practice to sustain people during these stressful times, but also the continuing compassion and practical support for the most vulnerable in our communities. I wonder if I might turn back now to Sheikh Mubabji in Uganda, wondering if you're able to join us at this point. Well, we're delighted. We'll keep coming back to Uganda, but before I turn to Europe and our friends in Europe, I wonder if I would invite the Venerable Yeath now to reflect with us on the challenge of leadership in your community under this pandemic. Welcome to the conversation.
Hi, everyone. I'm very sorry for the technical problems. I tried very hard to join the last 30 minutes. Now I did it. Thank you very much. And back in Cambodia, we do have some challenges that we are facing this day. One thing is, one of the most important, one of the most challenging is all religions have not been able to speak in one voice in terms of the origin of the virus. Some people still believe that the virus is not earthly virus. It is a sort of divine punishment. So this understanding leading to less engagement in combating the outbreak of the virus. But most of the religious practitioners still accept that this virus is earthly, but some of them are not. So it is very difficult for us as a religious leader to convince that this is an earthly virus. And the other challenges is the understanding of the medical knowledge is very limited among our underprivileged population. So it is very difficult for us to help them to understand what is the reality of the coronavirus. Because some groups still keeping praying to the religious figures, and the other one is we are still lacking of the material resources, which make us as religious leader to fulfill the great demands from the publics. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. We've heard really from Tunisia and there from Cambodia the importance of local strategies to respond to this crisis. I'm going to turn now to Imam Razawi, speaking in the UK, but with an international community perspective from your own tradition. Welcome, Imam, and your sense of the challenge your community is facing. And again, local strategies that are being developed to respond to it, both spiritually and in humanity.
Some of the points that may not have been raised. I think the biggest anxiety for me really isn't the pandemic itself, but I guess it's the global nature of the pandemic. We've seen pandemics over centuries come and go, especially as faith communities. We've survived them. To give you an example, about 100 years ago when the cholera pandemic hit Baghdad, the Jewish community had to bring rabbis in from Aleppo because of the severity of this. So we're used to pandemics. It's the global tapestry, I guess, that is very challenging. And if a solution is to be found, it must include all of humanity coming together. So I guess it's how do we coordinate various communities? And on a micro level, the problem, or I guess the challenge that I'm facing is how do I coordinate the various international communities which we're responsible for? So I think it's not just about a cure for the virus itself, but I guess it's a holistic cure as to what the future is going to look like post this virus. And I guess when it comes to leadership, there are two things which are very important. One is to give your community hope. And specifically at this moment in time where life has completely changed for many of our congregants. And I think the second thing is vision. What will the vision be? And so based on hope and vision, I guess there's three things which now worry me at night. I think the first thing is with the economy needing to recover, will this lead to an abuse of the environment? So will industry, governments overlook the environmental question in a race to try and boost their economy again? I think the second thing is that religions must behave as a moral, I'd say, compass, because otherwise what we're seeing is immoral behavior, which leads to scapegoating, which leads to violence, which leads to all types of atrocity. And the one thing I fear is that there may be atrocity which takes place on the back of this. And I guess really the third thing is that those extremists within society, be they secular or religious, how will they react? And as you've already heard, the rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of Islamophobia. So I guess these are challenges that we're facing, but more on a micro level, I guess. On the micro level, it's really standard of living of our community members. How do we supplement for that? You've already heard the idea of worship. Worship has taken a new kind of focus in our lives, as opposed to communal, which is what the community is. And Ramadan is a month of community coming together. We've adapted, and Zoom and other platforms have allowed us to, for example, share lectures, talks, prayer, Quran. So I think that's also important. But I guess the main issue that I've faced on a practical level is burial. What do we do in regards to Muslim burial? And again, that's an anxiety which is different from country to country. Different European countries have different standards. So I think that's really the biggest challenge. I think the easiest thing really is to coordinate amongst faiths locally. For example, when it comes to the homeless, I'll give you an example. In London, 3,000 homeless people in a week were housed. Now that's quite a success. for communities to come together to do that. So, on an interfaith level, on a local interfaith level, it seems to be working. But really the conclusion is this: how do we get through this as a global network of human beings?
Thank you so much, Imam Razawi. These are very helpful insights. Once again, emphasizing the importance of local strategies and collaboration, but we hear Venerable Youth saying in some contexts, lack of resources are also a challenge there. In a moment, Dr. Hassan, I will turn to you in Cairo, but first, Bishop Stalset, would you reflect on how the churches and your community are meeting this challenge and what you see as the biggest challenge for leadership at this time, Bishop Stalset? You'll find that the mute button bottom left on your screen.
Sure.
Thank you. Oh, it's very fickle, the mute button. You press it and it sneaks back on. Bottom left of your screen, Bishop Stalset. There we are. Thank you. Welcome.
Yes, there we are. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this inspiring and informative conversation, which in my view underscores the importance of Religions for Peace as an organization of leadership. And at this time of great crisis coming after the climate, or at the same time as a climate crisis and other, we see the need to reflect on both faith-specific leadership, that is to understand it from within each faith, but also in the global universal context to address it out of shared values, if there are such. And I submit that there are such. In the Christian and Jewish tradition, in the Abrahamic tradition, we underscore the love of God, or to love God and the neighbor as yourself. This is expressed in other traditions in different words, but I think that if we look at that as a base value or as a faith imperative, that is being tested in all aspects at this time. Love of God, if this is a curse of God, can he be loved? Can God be loved? Love of the neighbor, is that limited to some neighbors with which we are more familiar, or is it universal? And love of yourself as yourself is, in my reading, and underscoring the inherent dignity of every human being. All these three remind us of what is worth loving, and that in the context of creation, of the global responsibility that we have. I cannot speak on behalf of Christianity, but I observe from this crowded office of mine as a retired Bishop of Oslo, I observe that all Christian communities have, on the international level, have been very vocal in confirming the role of religion and faith in overcoming both the ethical dilemma, the spiritual challenges, the theological, the thought dimensions of this, but also addressing social and cultural issues. One political and theological challenge is, of course, to see faith and facts together. That has been addressed by a couple of other speakers, but I think that within the Christian community, the unifying voice is that which sees faith accepting the voice of science and common sense, and from there on being able to work together, both on the political level, on the social and religious levels, with people of all faith and of no faith. The challenges that have been addressed more broadly, however, relate to the practical level of worship. On the 15th of March, I was supposed to give a sermon at the Cathedral of Oslo, and 2 days before that was cancelled because of the situation. And a few days later, all the services, all the churches were closed. We celebrated Easter without being able to celebrate it in our churches. And this, of course, we shared with people of other faiths, with the Jews, with the Muslims and others. And there has been a valid and important preoccupation in a way with the worship and spiritual dimension, and that should be respected and solved within each community. But we cannot, what should I say, we cannot shy away from the fundamental theological challenge that this raises about sectarianism, about isolationism, about seeing your own faith as the only area of your concern. So the theological challenge here, I think, needs to be addressed and being perhaps also not only stated by professors and bishops, but by the common people, that they see their responsibility is guided by a care, an ethic of care, and an affirmation of faith as a dimension of reality. Faith and facts go together.
Thank you so much, Bishop, for these helpful points. And from the Center of Theological Inquiry, thank you for stressing the importance of theology, not only for scholars on the screen, but for all people of faith in different traditions. Dr. Kamal Hassan, you've been graciously patient in waiting to come into this conversation. I'm welcoming you now, but before I do, I'm glad to say that Sheikh Mubaji from Uganda will be joining us soon, and we look forward to welcoming him, His Eminence, into our conversation. Dr. Hassan, welcome, and the challenge from your perspective in Cairo and Egypt. Your mute button, bottom left on your screen, join the club of bottom left. If you put your cursor, there we go. And may I just, before you speak, Dr. Hassan, welcome His Eminence Sheikh Shaban Mubaji. We're honored to have you with us in the conversation. Dr. Hassan is about to speak from Cairo, and then, Your Eminence, I will ask you to reflect on the challenge of this pandemic from your community and perspective in Uganda. But first, Dr. Hassan in Egypt.
Thank you so much for this invitation, for this call. I'm really happy to be with you today. Do you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Concerning my context, let me at the very beginning to reassure you that the situation here in Egypt is under control, alhamdulillah. The number of the cases announced is about 4,500. Those who passed away is unfortunately 317. So the number is very little in comparison to the number of the cases and those who passed away in many countries. And this is actually due to the precautionary measures adopted by the government. There were a curfew from the very beginning, and there were precautionary measures adopted by the government, and they started to announce it to the people and to ask them to stay home and to follow these precautionary measures. Actually, if we are talking about, the challenges of the religious leaders in this context or in our context, if we are talking about, the greatest challenge is how to find, a theological, a fundamental theological challenge for the religious leaders to convince the people not to perform the rituals as they were accustomed in the past in the mosques or in the churches even, because here all the precautionary measures is applied to everyone. There is no distinction here. That this COVID is not distinguishing between people on the basis of their races or faiths or colors. It's affecting everyone, and my neighbors, if they were afflicted, also be affected. So it was a challenge for the religious leaders to convince the people. And there were, many fatwas from Al-Azhar here, from Al-Azhar Global Center, and from the senior scholars at Al-Azhar to tell the people that it was the customs of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ not to go to the mosque in the rain during the rainy days. If there were rain, so they were kept at home and they will stay at home. There is no danger. The rain is not very dangerous. So, and by analogy, you can stay at home, because your life is threatened. You can lose your life. And the second basis of their fatwas is based on one of the ultimate objectives of the Sharia, which is to be found in every religion, I think, whether it is man-made religion or a heavenly religion, is protecting man's life takes priority over anything. If we are talking about the lives of the people, this is one of the ultimate objectives of the Sharia in Islam. And it takes priority over going to the mosque or over observing the rituals in a closed place. And I think the same procedures has been adopted by the Christians as well. They closed their churches and even the celebrations were cancelled here. So the second important point I would like to talk about is that if there is any modern issue, because we cannot actually separate the coronavirus or the danger of the coronavirus from the ecological issues. In fact, if you are digging very deep in the teachings of the very religion, you will discover that Allah has created this universe, and that this universe is considered to be God's gift to human being. And this God's gift is not an absolute gift for man, but there is a code of ethics that should be maintained in order to benefit from the divine gift. First is to strike some kind of balance between our inner and outer environment. And second is to do what is good and forbid what is right. This is to be seen in many verses in the Quran. The third principles in dealing with the environment is, from my point of view, moderation. And moderation is another principle dealing with everything listenable. So we shouldn't go to the extreme in developing our world at the expense of our and at the expense of the coming generation. Natural world is a trust. We should keep it. We should all common responsibility to protect ourselves and protect our families, and we should follow the procedures adopted by all the government. There is an important point I would like to highlight that it seems that this pandemic will take too much time, and we have to accustom ourselves. We have to live with it. We have to follow the procedures, and we have to live with this COVID-19.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan, for these important points. I'm delighted now that we can turn to Sheikh Muraji, and I'd like to ask Your Eminence now to reflect with us on the challenge as you see it in Uganda in the leadership of your community at this time. Welcome.
Thank you very much, dear participants and moderator. I thank the Almighty for enabling us to meet and discuss on the current situation. In Uganda, with the population of close to 40 million people now, during this situation, yes, we have so far 76 people who have been cases confirmed, and about 40 have been released, discharged, about no deaths so far. Now the challenge is that in Uganda, being a poor country, the government has been very strong and very strict about following the measures, the SOPs, standard operational procedures, and the people have been law-abiding and very compliant to the situation. The government has not found any difficulties in guiding the public, and the public are very compliant. Given what is taking place in other areas where there are more cases and more deaths, more people who have been affected, and being a poor country, the challenge is that now the situation has now prolonged. People have been very compliant, and they are following the guidelines. And the government is also, the president is also happy, because when we cooperate with those, the government and the public, then things go in the normal way. Now the challenge is that now people who are poor, who are remaining at home, who are not accessing the daily requirements, the daily needs, are now they are now losing patience because they want to go out. We have transport of motorbikes, border borders, known as border borders, as transporters. We have millions of motorbikes which do transport. Now they are not. They live from hand to mouth. Now they are not getting any food, any sustainability. Now they are, as we talk now, they are coming out the streets, because the government said you have only transport goods, not individuals, because of the social distancing. Because on a motorbike, people cannot distance themselves more than a meter. So it is to carry cargo, only cargo, not people, not passengers. Now public transport has been banned, has been stopped, but now people are moving on foot. They are coming to the shops in the town, even those ones, the places where there are no essential goods like hardwares, selling construction materials. And now people are sitting at the doors, just locked doors, but inside, when you come, somebody asks you, what do you want? Do you want angle bars? Do you want bags of cement? Then you can say, okay, bring your car behind. Now this, the lockdown is prolonging, and people tend to be now coming on foot and pouring in the town. That is a challenge that now we religious leaders, we want to talk to the government to say that at least there is a way they can loosen the guidelines, so that maybe they can go to level 3, so that they allow some people to look for food, because the government wanted to distribute food, but now, up to now, out of Kampala, a city of targeted 2 million people, they have not gotten food for the past 3 weeks, and the government distributing about 10,000 per day food packages to individuals. So when are they going to? Now the challenge is that in this situation, we need to consider those, the government, to consider the common man who lives on hand to mouth. Yes. And at the same time, people must also follow the distance, the social distancing, and also to follow the SOPs, so that we can try to come together, so that we ease the situation. Otherwise, our fear is that people may lose, even religious leaders who are trying to support the government. People are coming to us, but religious leaders, help us, talk to the government to loosen the strings. Yes. And we are also, when we talk to the government said, no, if we loosen the strings, we are to handle the blame. We are the ones to face it. So the challenge is that we have to try to bring together to just a win-win situation, so that we don't, we help the government at the same time to help the individuals.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Babji, for that very clear picture and common themes emerging of their local strategies in helping communities discover practices of faith and worship and prayer within families in the lockdown, a deep concern for the vulnerable, a concern about scapegoating under the impact of this pandemic. We're now going to think in more detail in 2 areas about the ways in which this pandemic is having an impact on the concerns of religion for peace, for positive peace. First, I would invite my colleague from the Center of Theological Inquiry, Dr. Fred Simmons, to reflect with us now on the role of religious ethics and why religious ethics have a key role in leadership in responding to this pandemic challenge and developing a vision of a better post-pandemic world. Dr. Simmons now, welcome.
Thank you. In basic terms, leadership amidst this pandemic involves at least three principal elements: science, governance, and ethics. Scientific expertise is necessary because leadership in a pandemic world requires knowledge of the disease, how it spreads, and how it may be treated. Governance is likewise necessary to craft and implement policies that stem this spread, organize this treatment, and compensate for the costs incurred by these responses. These costs are enormous and affect different groups differently. And this is where ethics, religious and otherwise, may make their vital contribution. For it is ethics that determine which costs are recognized, how their relative significance is assessed, and what their just distribution requires. To appreciate this role for ethics, ponder global public health more generally. The world community has made tremendous gains in global public health over the last century. These gains, however, have left some behind and inadvertently harmed others. Moreover, many of these gains have come at great environmental cost, meaning that present public health has been promoted by imperiling future public health, to say nothing of the health of all the non-human life, both present and future, with whom we share the planet. It is the role of ethics to sensitize us to the breadth of these costs, link them with these gains, and help us discern how to balance all of these competing factors properly. This role for ethics, in turn, renders religious leadership vital to a pandemic world. For it is religious traditions that broaden the sphere of ethical concern and call us to consider displacing ourselves from the center of that broadened sphere. Likewise, it is religious traditions that teach the normative importance of accepting limitation and offer guidance for making the choices among goods that such limitations impose. And it is religious leaders that help their traditions' adherents to recognize the relevance of these ethical resources and apply them wisely to the ever-shifting array of choices among goods that circumstances afford and inflict. In particular, a pandemic world foregrounds choices between the fundamental goods of public health, environmental reprieve, and economic development. Ultimately, none of these goods is sustainable without the others. Yet they cannot always all be promoted at once, and pursuit of one can sometimes contravene another, as the global lockdowns boon to public and environmental health, but simultaneous economic devastation attests. A pandemic world dramatizes the perennial need to diminish these trade-offs and allocate well those that remain. It thereby also attests to religious ethics' pivotal role in leading in this new normal. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, for making the case for the importance of religious ethics to help us weigh up these difficult decisions about different goods of health, of economic well-being, and so on that we've heard. I wonder if I might turn to Professor Ramachan, just reflecting on the role of religious ethics and helping communities and leaders weigh up these things that we've heard from around the world, the tensions between government resources, public health priorities, concern about the most vulnerable who are economically devastated by the lockdown. The role of religious ethics, Professor Ramachan. Again, your microphone muted bottom left. If you would unmute, thank you.
Thank you. certainly concur with so much that has been said, and especially on the significance of ethics. I think that to sort of crystallize some of this, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic is an opportunity for leadership, religious but other kinds of leadership, to ask and to ponder two fundamental questions. First, what can we learn that is significant for the transformation and enrichment of our community? In other words, how is this pandemic a kairos, an opportunity for new learning? And secondly, and perhaps here's where the ethical focus comes in, how can we grow in caring and inclusive, very inclusive caring and serving? I think these two questions are interrelated. How we answer the first, what do we learn, will determine, how we answer the second. I think we have all, in so many of our comments, we have emphasized and we have all spoken, or at least mentioned, the complex and interrelated systems in which we live. We're all familiar with the butterfly effect, which was developed by the American meteorologists to explain the possibility that small causes could have momentous effects. The idea of the butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon and causing a storm in Europe may not be literally true, but I think it does underline our interconnectedness, something that is very dear to us in the Hindu tradition. But when it comes to ethics, I think that from the perspective of our religious traditions and from the perspective of science, we all speak in a similar voice about interconnectedness. But I think where we need to speak more together about ethics is to enunciate what are our moral obligations in an interconnected world. In other words, it is not enough simply to speak about the fact of interconnectedness, but to speak about moral obligations. And when I speak about moral obligations here, I mean not moral obligations to our own communities, but moral obligations to the human community and even beyond the human community, moral obligations to the planet. Because I think that this interconnectedness also signifies our vulnerability. We understand this much better today. And the one important teaching, theological teaching from the Hindu tradition that I've taught a lot about in these times is the Sanskrit word loka sangraha. And this comes from the text, the Bhagavad Gita, which implores us that in all that we do, we ought to think of the universal common good. The loka sangraha must also be part of our ethical reflection. We must consider the consequences for the common good on all the choices that we make. So that to conclude, I think that we need an ethical commitment to the universal common good. But of course, as we have already said, this commitment also has to focus in a very special way on those who suffer because of the systemic structures of poverty and lack of access to resources in which they find themselves. We see a tension, ethical tension in our world today also, that leaders, religious or political, who do not support policies, ethical policies that acknowledge the reality of our interconnectedness are dangerous leaders.
Yes.
They're destructive, they are dangerous. Their appeals to narrow interests constitute a palpable danger in our own times. And from the religious world, we need to contest and to challenge that kind of leadership, whether it's in our own communities or beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ramachan. The moral obligations we face in our interdependent world. Bishop Stalsett, I invite you to unmute your microphone And I'll also turn in a moment to Rabbi Rosen. 2 brief comments on our ethical obligations in this context as integral to your leadership. Bishop Stalser.
Thank you. Thank you for this. I think that one of the main challenges is aligning religion with reality, and that is an ethical challenge. If I look at it, we have to find ways to address the inequality among nations, societies, communities, individuals, and to develop an ethics of care which is inclusive. We may contribute to that from different religious traditions. We may offer spiritual inspiration and strength to the reflection, but the expression of the ethics of care is not religion specific. It is an ethics that is universal. And that, I think, is the beauty of Religion for Peace, that we all the time try to find ways at first to express that which is religion specific, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, and so on. Then what is our commonality? How can we address together? But we have to realize and open the space to say that this is a common human exercise. And that leads us to the international level of respecting the inherent dignity of every human being and standing together with people of faith and no faith, for instance, in the Sustainable Development Goals, as one of the many examples of an ethics of care, which is enriched by theological and spiritual insights, but which is not the ownership of us alone.
Thank you so much, Bishop Stel, for that helpful remark. Rabbi Rosen, the ethical dimension of leadership at this time.
Of course, I agree with all the important things that have been said. I think, however, that religion, we need to appreciate that religion is more than faith. And that for, I think, all of our religions, but some perhaps more than others, would describe themselves as ways of life. In other words, the leadership's responsibility is to highlight the fact that if there isn't a practical implementation to your religious affiliation, then in fact the latter is empty. And even more than that, within many traditions, there are practical ramifications. Your diet, your consumption, your whole practical relationship to the material world is a religious ethical imperative. And that's more important today than ever before, because today we can see how interconnected all these things are. The breakdown between human consumption and the pre-Anthropocene world that has basically led and connected to these pandemics and destructions is all part of our exploitation of the material world without there being a sense of moral responsibility, of delayed gratification, of boundaries, of discipline. Discipline is a critical component of a religious way of life that relates to diet, that relates to the environment, that relates to all different aspects of living. And very often these have become undermined by certain modern forces. And there is a critical importance to need to emphasize these, to emphasize our responsibility towards sentient animal life, towards the ecosystem as a whole. In other words, if this is not affecting, if nothing should be able to impact more upon the necessity for our religious ethical imperatives to adopt a different kind of diet and lifestyle than the impact of this pandemic. It should restore us back to the comprehensive, inclusive, interconnected, religious, ethical way of life that the vast majority of our traditions espouse.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Rosen. I think you've seen from these 3 perspectives, and I know there could be more, but with an eye on the clock, thank you very much for affirming that ethical dimension in its many facets for the global common good. I'm now going to turn to my third CTI colleague, Dr. Lisa Leroux in South Africa. Lisa, reflect with us now on the way in which this pandemic is impacting on issues of violence, particularly against women and children at this time, and the most vulnerable. Welcome.
Thank you. So like Will said, my work around the world is on gender equality and gender-based violence in relation to religion. So this is a framing for me to reflect more broadly on what this pandemic might mean for social norm change. And so what we've learned from previous epidemics, and we see now being repeated, is that women and girls are disproportionately affected. In large part because of the gender norms that dictate that what women should and shouldn't do. So women carry the burden of care, both within the official health system, but also informally at home. They're most affected when informal economies are halted. They're the ones most affected when poverty strikes, when food becomes scarce, when family planning options become unavailable. So just to name a few examples. So I'm in a country with hard lockdown at the moment, and as I'm sure those of you in similar situations have seen, is that there's been a dramatic increase in violence against women. Now, to be honest, we expected that this would happen because research across the world has shown repeatedly that even in normal times, a woman's home is the most dangerous space for her. It's her intimate partner that's most likely to do her harm. So now with lockdown, she's forced to stay in her home, which is often our setting with increasing levels of poverty, potential substance abuse, high levels of stress, social isolation. These are all drivers of gender-based violence. Now, gender-based violence was already a worldwide pandemic before COVID-19 struck, but the combination of the two has definitely made life more dangerous for women. And this will continue post-COVID. Our economies won't recover quickly. Poverty and fear will remain. And under these kind of circumstances, gender-based violence thrives, and especially intimate partner violence. With our constructs of hegemonic masculinity primarily relying on this idea of a powerful man, a powerful male, the control and violence against a partner or a child can become the only form of agency and power that many men have left in such a situation. But this is not where my reflection on a COVID world ends. Just as this pandemic is devastating for the safety of women and children, I also truly believe it has tremendous potential for harboring changes that can fundamentally shift how we see and value men and women and the relationship between them. We know that with crises like war or similar upheaval, the gender roles and restrictions placed especially on women are often eased in some ways. And this is where I think the positive potential of this pandemic lies. It allows us an opportunity to revisit how we believe people should act and society should function. We know that unequal gender norms lie at the heart of gender-based violence. So in changing these norms, we not only allow for a more gender equal society, we also contribute to eradicating gender-based violence. And this opportunity for norm change is wider than only gender norms. And I think this really links to what we've been discussing up to this point. What has our existing social norms meant for peace? What has it meant for the planet? In this upheaval of COVID-19, we're confronted with what our world of exclusion, exploitation, and discrimination has done. And in this upheaval, in this ceasing of what's normal, we're given the opportunity to change the normal. And I think this is tremendous. It's amazing. The risk is that this opportunity, this gap that we have, it won't last long. And we've seen this in other settings of upheaval, especially with armed conflict. It's like there's a small window where you can actually change things. But if you don't really put the effort into it, things won't change. Because the old normal is the easier one to accept, and there are these set patterns that people just fall back into. So a post-COVID new normal won't automatically be a better normal, but it will require considerable effort. And this is where I believe there is a crucial role for faith leaders like yourself, for religious leaders. We know how much influence religious leaders can have on people's ideas and beliefs. And like you just said religion is a way of life. Through what religious leaders teach and explain and model based on their own lives, through these avenues, they really have the ability to shift social norms. So this can be a shift to recognize the dignity and the equality and the rights of the female other, but also to shift to bring a recognition of the dignity and equality and rights of the religious other, of the ethnic other, of the historical other. So that's where I want to leave you, that COVID-19 is devastating, yes, but I truly believe that this global public health crisis can be turned to a force for good too, because it's forcing us to stop our existing normal, and it's offering an opportunity to start a new normal, and one that can be safe and recognizes the dignity and equality and rights of all others. Thank you.
Dr. Leroux, thank you so much. I'm going to turn quickly to Imam Razawi. Imam, a small window for change to counter exclusionary discourses and violent behaviors, your sense of that?
I think so. I'm reminded of a quote that I wrote down yesterday by Viktor Frankl, who was a survivor of the Holocaust. And he said that an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. And I guess that within the norm, we have to become slightly more abnormal in our reaction. And I think that's going to be appreciated as well by communities. So I think we are in a situation whereby we can make pragmatic decisions coming together to be able to resolve some of this conflict, some of this confusion that's taking place. And as has been mentioned previously, I guess for most of us, religion is a way of life. And part of that life, I guess it's our principles of virtue ethics. And I guess virtue ethics goes back to balance. So there needs to be a balance from a previous world. And I guess this is a transition period where you had, let's say, 3 months ago or 2 months ago, random extremes from unethical behavior to violent extremism. And I guess now it's the time to really shake things up and to move forward to, I guess, abnormal reaction to this particular situation. So, yeah, so in conclusion, I think that we are seeing, or we can see, a promise of a better world, but we've got to first of all recognize the problems. And as has been mentioned, from gender violence, and that was an opener for me, an eye-opener for me. Once we've highlighted these, I guess there are people in the world who can then influence change. And this is why this conversation is so important, because it highlights things that we ordinarily wouldn't have come to listen to. And then it allows us to strategize together. And then it allows us together to lead to some kind of a resolution. So I see hope in this, and I see that we can together make a big difference by highlighting, as we have done, some of the issues.
Thank you so much, Imam. The Honorable Labida Meeza, in Tunisia, we are thinking about gender-based violence under this pandemic. We would welcome your reflection on this challenge and this window for change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, besides being in Religions for Peace and in this interfaith activities in Tunisia, I am parliamentarian. And as also parliamentarian, I am one of the leaders of women leaders in facing violence against women. And so I'm specifically sensitive to this issue. And one of my first reaction with group of women from different organizations in Tunisia is that we asked for figures from the Ministry of Women. And unfortunately, we discovered that there is a high increase of the calls on the green number by women complaining about violence, domestic violence. So this confinement, being at home, especially for poor people, for people who are living in small housing, and it is very often joined to consumption of alcohol beverages also in this period. coincides awakening trees on violence on women. And it is, we have to face such problem, and we try together to pass a message through TV, because these people usually in sitting at home, they watch TV, and sensitizing to religious people, and those who have let's say developed a vision of dialogue within the family, relations between men and women, respect of human dignity, and also of speaking of love. Yes, love is something that we do not often speak, and sometimes never in some families. And of course, we try to organize. We've organized 3 meetings on like this by Zoom with women who are leading groups of supporting women victims of violence, and also communicating with them, not to let them, let's say, in their home, at the same time victim of violence and silence, because they cannot go out, they cannot speak. This is a real issue. It is an issue especially which becomes very, very hard when it is accompanied by economic situation that is very hard. So I think religious values here are not only preaching love, respect, dialogue, but also helping people in this difficult society, economically, helping them by making this period easier to live for the man who has lost, for example, his job, or the woman who has to provide for food in this very difficult situation. This may reduce violence, but indeed it is a real issue, and we have to pay it more attention, and really to be creative in our ways as religious people in facing this issue, especially in this very, very hard and difficult situation.
Thank you so much, very much. Jeremy sent in a question asking how, from your perspective in Tunisia, involved in constitutional change, and the other leaders might help us develop strategies for the post-pandemic world. But I think you have done that magnificently. Thank you so much. Reverend Wada, briefly on this point of violence against women, a brief reflection before we turn to our third question on the challenge of holistic leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Storer. So aggressive and violent behaviors towards others, as Imam said, that comes from abnormal anxiety, fear, and frustrations. So we think that kind of faith-based psychosocial program has become more important. And for example, Reasons for Peace Japan is now to try to launch next week, together with interfaith chaplaincy group, to provide counseling through this Zoom system. And also, but it might be, it become more difficult for women staying at home to approach to the carers or counselors. And also our challenge is how to reach out to those who do not wish or do not have a means to leave the aggressive discourses and behavior. It is more difficult, we struggle. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, giving us a sense of a local strategy using social media, Zoom, to reach out to vulnerable people in their homes at this time. We now come to the heart of our conversation, pulling together these different themes. We've had regional pictures of the challenges for leadership in this pandemic. We've had a sense of the importance of religious ethics and an ethic of universal concern beyond our own communities. And we've heard about the devastating impact of the pandemic on hate and violence, crimes against the vulnerable. But we've also had this strong message from all of you about the importance of moral obligation, fleshing out what our independent world must become. And so I'd like to turn in closing to my colleague, Professor Liz Grant again. Liz, help us to think about how we think holistically about leadership in this time. You have a model that you want to share with us that really brings us to both to the heart of the pandemic and the heart of the leadership challenge. Do share that with us now.
Thank you. And I think what I'm going to say now, each of you have touched on in many ways, thinking about what this new paradigm needs to look like, this new reimagined future where we are participating, because the pandemic and actually the public health responses to the pandemic have posed huge crises. But they've also calling us to think differently. And what I want to just present briefly is this idea of a concept of planetary health. Planetary health being based on the understanding that human health and the whole health of humanity in the world depends on flourishing natural and societal systems and the wise stewardship of these and a compassionate care together. It depends on an understanding of the equality of humanity as at the heart of where we're at. And we know, we've referenced that up until now, the whole drive and development and growth has actually been destructive of the very systems, the natural systems that have kept the world together. We have degraded those, and we've degraded those to points where we are seeing this zoonotic jump. We have destroyed natural habitat and animal habitat, and actually that's been part of the drive of COVID. But planetary health has at its very heart this ambition to change, to turn around this degradation of nature, and to look at turning around also the unbridled growth of the inequalities that have been exacerbated by the unfair distribution of the world's assets. And it needs to look at what does it mean, and someone referenced this before, to think about the global common assets that we have in the world today, and how do we bring those together to flourish. You know, in 2015, the Planetary Health Commission of the Lancet, which is one of the big medical journals, had a statement in that commission that said, we've mortgaged the health of future generations for the development gains of the present. And what's so shocking to everybody, even scientists, is that actually it's not the health of future generations. We're realizing we have mortgaged our health and the health of future generations. And we need to do something dramatic. But there's a second, almost like an irony happening, because the strategies for responding to the pandemic, the strategies around lockdown, the strategies around physical distancing, the strategies that are stopping the carbon emissions through flights, these strategies are actually healing nature. But, and you've said this, but at a price, at a cost that's too great, because the cost is being borne by the poor. The poor are paying with their lives for the public health responses as we try and mitigate this pandemic. The Sustainable Development Goals that were set out in 2015 to 2030, these 15 years, these goals set out a blueprint of what we could achieve. In essence, what's needed is a collective effort of people worldwide to generate the knowledge and to educate about, to advocate for, to enact the policies of the goals, and to live in and develop a world where there is an equality, a balance. And actually, as scientists and as professionals across so many domains, we know what to do to move forward, to have a planetary health agenda. We actually know the science behind it, but we don't know how. And this is the point where for religious leaders, faith leaders, religious communities have such a power, because as you have all said, you have an understanding, you know the how and the why as well as the what. And this is a bit that we need to come to. So what are the ways of achieving the same gains, those unintended environmental consequences that the mitigation containment strategies actually have shown us? The fact that the waters of Venice are running clear, the fact that the coral is beginning to come back in places, the fact that our nature is clearer. What are those mitigating strategies that we can begin to develop that are pro-poor and responsive? What are the ways of addressing this greatest inequity where the conditions, the inequality conditions around rapid industrialization, urbanization are impacting those who are least able to be responsive? And what are the ways to reimagine this future that where individual and collective living is respectful and responsive to living within the planetary boundaries that each of you have mentioned and the boundaries of our climate? And how can we share this with world leaders so that the deep knowledge that faith traditions, that religious traditions have embedded in the sacred traditions and scriptures, how can we share that becomes a discourse that is a norm for scientists, a norm for political leaders, a discourse that discourse of compassion, and compassion in a planetary health way becomes a way forward. I want to just pose a couple of more comments around a leadership opportunity that is there, is recognizing the power that lies in what the current pandemic has called us to see, and the planetary crisis, because the pandemic is mirrored in this planetary crisis, but to recognize the power, as Lisa mentioned, if we see it through the eyes of faith, and to see also how the images, how our art, how our faith, how our worship, how our prayer can help protect the world that's shocked at the minute, and help us to sort of understand this interconnectivity between human and planetary health, between the past and the present and the future, between the one and the many. It's that combination that we need. How can we identify the hidden costs and the unintended consequences of our actions? How can we call those out and reflect on the nature of hospitality? Because I think in the planetary health paradigm, there's an extraordinary image of hospitality, of a welcoming the stranger, the outsider, the migrant, bringing people together, an image where the sick are healed, where the carer is cared for. And I'll close there, and I think we'll have some conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. I want to turn first to Professor Ramachan. That planetary health paradigm, I think, resonates with many of the religious insights you've brought to our conversation. Holistic thinking on leadership, your own perspective, briefly on that, Professor Ramachan.
Very briefly, I think there is no doubt, I believe that, that we are blessed with the resources, material and technical necessary for holistic development, especially as Professor Grant mentioned, Sustainable Development Goals is a statement of what is the common good. But the challenge is whether as a global community, Professor, we have the moral will and the commitment to implement the changes that are necessary. We have the resources. What we lack is the moral will and the commitment. So the one point I want to make in conclusion, lifting this up, is that the world that we imagine, the world that we commit ourselves to building, depends fundamentally on our understanding of what it means to be human and the ethics of our obligation to each other. So that a discourse about development that does not acknowledge, identify, and emphasize the ethical transformations that are necessary for solving the problems of poverty, inequality, species extinction, global warming, all mentioned by Professor Grant, is incomplete are unlikely to succeed without recognizing the transformation that is necessary. You know, Pope Francis described this ethical challenge in a very pertinent phrase as the globalization of indifference. The globalization of indifference. And I think that this globalization of of indifference will only be overcome. And here is where our religious traditions become central, by a moral transformation that opens up our hearts to seeing the suffering of other beings as our own suffering, and which finds outward expression in active commitment to overcoming the structures that perpetuate this suffering.
Thank you so much, Professor Ramachan. I'm going to turn to Professor Karam now, and she's going to bring in some much appreciated comments from our wider viewers around the world, thinking about holistic leadership, some key questions from them. Professor Karam.
Thank you very much indeed. Just a very brief point to mention that there's been tremendous appreciation of this dialogue as it has unfolded. A few very pertinent points that were raised. Perhaps one can be summarized in terms of that we've heard a lot about the positive implications and potentials and opportunities of the religious communities and institutions, but we may have heard relatively less about some of the problematique posed by certain religious actors and certain religious institutions in the context of this crisis. Another excellent point that came from Archbishop Antje Jacqueline from the Primate of the Church of Sweden, who mentions, and I read out, besides ethics and way of life, as important as that is, I think we also need theological reflection on questions like how is creation good, interconnectedness of natural and moral evil, human strength and vulnerability, the nature and praxis of lament, what we may hope for, and how to cultivate it. So excellent comments and questions there for the information and the wrap-up, hopefully, by all of you on the issues of holistic leadership. Thank you. Over to you, Professor Storer.
Thank you, and thank you to the Archbishop for setting the research agenda for the Center of Theological Inquiry for the coming years. These are very profoundly important theological questions. I want to turn now to Venerable Yeath in Cambodia to reflect with us from your Buddhist perspective. How do we approach the challenge of holistic leadership and think about it in the way that motivates people to act for change for the common good? The Venerable Yeath. Your mute button, bottom left, if you would turn that off now. Thank you, welcome.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I think from Buddhist perspective to these challenges is the first thing is to acknowledge the fear that the pandemic really caused fear among the populations. We have to accept that. And the second one, I think we have to practice the mindfulness and meditation. Especially, we have to be aware of that, what is really going on in terms of the coronavirus and the danger of the disease, the virus that really had a big impact on the populations. And the third one, we have to cultivate the compassion toward each other in terms of human beings, or in terms of brotherhood, as we are sharing the same planet. We must break the barrier of the differences in terms of religious denomination or whatever belief we adhere to. We have to cultivate the compassion from our own hearts to see that the whole human race are our race, and we share the same planet. We are living in the same home, on the same boat. And the fourth one, I think we have to understand our interconnections, that this pandemic is really bad for sure, but amid this darkness, we also can see that the light, that the human beings can learn that we are interconnected. nobody can survive on this planet independently. We have to work together and see this connection is really deep-rooted in our in our society. And the last one to conclude is, I think we must use this time to reflect what we have done in the past in terms of the environmental protection and the unity, solidarity that we usually had neglected in the past. I think this pandemic should be the time for us to reflect what is happening in the past and what should we do in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Venerable Yeath, for echoing that planetary vision that Liz sent out for us. Rabbi Rosen, just briefly as we're coming into the last minutes, but this concern from some of our viewers that religious communities and traditions, without thinking of anyone in particular, must acknowledge their own responsibility and sometimes culpability in some of the problems we're now facing globally beyond the pandemic.
Of course, we all have a lot of repentance to do, and we have all failed our traditions in different ways. And above all, we have been party to what I would call a rampant secular materialism that sees the world's resources as purely for our own service and to exploit with unlimited, in an unbridled, unlimited fashion. That is at the heart of our current day crisis. And we have to return to the authentic teachings of our traditions to emphasize the sense of the sacred. And as Genesis teaches us, that we are here in the garden to work it and to preserve it, to protect it. That's precisely the imperative of sustainable development. And therefore, if religions are not promoting sustainable development, if they are not seeking to combat factory farming and all the diseases and catastrophes that are coming as a result of human avarice and material indulgence, especially for animal flesh, if we are not combating the deforestation and the degradation of our environment, we are failing the most sublime values of our heritage. Yes, we must take responsibility, but then there's still a challenge. We can talk in religious language to our religious communities, but not all of the world is religious, and not all the world has a sense of the sacred. And therefore, we also need to adapt language that is pragmatic and that highlights everything that others have been saying of this interconnectedness, and that we cannot, it's not responsible to ourselves and to our children and grandchildren to act independently of one another.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Rosen. Dr. Hassan in Cairo, a last word, a reflection on this challenge of thinking and acting holistically from your perspective. If you would unmute bottom left, your microphone. If you would unmute your microphone, Dr. Hassan, bottom left in your screen, that little, that's it. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. I do agree with all the comments made by my colleagues about that this virus is very dangerous. It comes to remind us of the interrelatedness of our relationship, and it is a test of our solidarity and how to act together in order to combat this virus and save the lives of millions all over the world, you know. And there is a huge opportunity for humankind to save our generation and the subsequent and the coming generation. So let me highlight 2 points here in this connection. If I'm talking from my own perspective as a Muslim, that in Islam, in the ethical framework, it's talking about saving the life of one man equals saving the life of humanity. So if you save, if we're talking from the ethical level of talking about the moral values, you know, that we should highlight that saving the life of one man equals to saving the humanity as a whole. The second point is that if we are talking about, you know, that man is God's vicegerent on this earth, and he is responsible for caring for this nature, protecting the environment, you know, and doing some kind of harmony between his own needs and between the environment. We do not own this environment, but this is actually should be owned by everyone, by the subsequent generation, you know, and we have to work for ourselves and for the subsequent generation as well. So we have a responsibility, and we as religious leaders we share the responsibility of raising some kind of awareness. I do agree with David Rosen that not all the people, are religious, but at least we have some kind of moral values or common sense that we should share together. We should search for a common ground upon which we can all stand together, because this is to save humanity as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that visionary note to end on our conversation, Dr. Hassan. We've heard from Liz Grant about planetary health, but I think in conclusion, from my perspective in moderating this conversation, you have left us all, both in the Zoom room, but around the world, with planetary hope. And in this time of planetary crisis, that is a great thing. I now turn to my co-moderator and colleague, Professor Azza Karam, Secretary General of Religions for Peace, to reflect on this conversation. Azza.
Thank you very much. Very conscious of the time and of the wealth that has been shared in terms of ideas and experiences already. I would only say a few takeaways, because there is no way to summarize everything that you have talked about. It literally is about the existential nature of what we are going through today. That does not get summarized. That merely gets reacted to from the heart at best. So a few points that I see have run through the various discussions and presentations that each of you has made. First of all, again, to highlight the fact that all of you on this particular conversation are speaking from experience and praxis, as well as intellectual richness. All of you speak with a level of moral authority and plenty of responsibility. None of you encapsulate everything in your respective traditions. You speak to the specific richness from each tradition. You've all acknowledged the responsibility that religious institutions and leadership in general entails, is inherent within it. You've also all mentioned in different ways, looking whether at environment or at violence issues or at specific communities and contexts, you've all somehow spoken to the othering that we do in general, and we particularly do at moments of great crises as we are facing today with COVID. We other all the time. Our moral infrastructure, the moral fiber of many nations, the discourse of political institutions and leadership has been one of othering, which extends the state of fear, which builds on and in a sense almost cements the fear that we heard many of you speak to. This politics of othering is what has created a remarkable rift and has weakened our societies considerably, morally, culturally, socially, politically, financially. We other one another. And the politics of othering that you all spoken to in different ways is precisely what, and I want to underline and nuance the fact that we had a professor of Hindu faith quoting the Catholic Pope, His Holiness, Pope Francis, which shows you the extent to which the discourse of religious leadership in and of itself is a globalized discourse. It is a discourse that, as Rabbi Rosen and Bishop Stallset and Dr. Kamal and many others have mentioned, is intertwined and interconnected. It is based on that which is common. The religious discourse of compassion, of tolerance, not just tolerance, but of love that many of you have spoken to as well. This is a globalized discourse, and it is the exact counter to the discourse of othering. The politics of othering is the politics of institutions as we know them today. The politics of care and compassion and the discourse of care and compassion is the discourse and praxis of religious leadership today. That is the discourse that we aspire to. That is the discourse that we want to hear a great deal more of. We want that to become the normal vis-a-vis the politics of othering. Where and when religious institutions have adopted the politics of othering, they have cemented, they continue to create the conditions for violence and hatred that we see with us today, that unfortunately COVID and its and confronting extends and accentuates. Where faith leaders and religious actors, through their praxis of living their religion and not only speaking to it and not only seeing it as a moral compass, but as a guide for everyday life, where religious leaders have indeed adopted that and spoken to it, they have become, in the words of Rabbi Rosen, exemplars of the kind of leadership that we want to see. Where we adopt the politics of othering, we increase the hate, we increase the violence. Where we adopt the poetics of compassion, which all of you have spoken to, that is where we create, and the opportunity to create a much more positively transformative potential. I'm grateful to Professor Leroux for pointing out that we other women. In most cultures, women are othered as the vulnerable. The girl child is othered as the most vulnerable. But Professor Leroux also told us this is an opportunity for transformation. Where we stop the politics of othering and we begin with the poetics of the compassion of all faiths, that is when there is no other anymore. Whether that other is female or of any other gender, or of any other religion, or of any other ethnicity, or of any other race, where we adopt the poetics of compassion that each of you represents and has built on and have careers that speak to and lives that speak to, we are at a moment of that transformative potential. All that is left for me is to bid you a tremendous note of gratitude and humility for your time, for your patience, but above all, for the words you have used, which are the words of the Creator, the words of compassion and mercy and love, that which creates religions for peace, not as an organization, but as a movement, which is where we are going, God willing, in this time to come. And we thank the conditions and circumstances around us for enabling us to come together and have this conversation. There is always grace and mercy in everything that the Creator does. Thank you to each of you. Thank you, Professor Storer and CTI, for the partnership. And thank you to each of our religious leaders in every sense of the word for exemplifying that which we need. Thank you.